Good afternoon, everyone. I would just really appreciate you joining us today. This is a meeting that has been several weeks in the making, and I think we are among the first groups to be able to get a hold of Ernie, and as he rolls out this book, and it was released on January 30th, and it's already made a lot of news, and it's I've seen it everywhere from Daniel Yergin commenting on it, and heard it on Marketplace. When you get featured on Marketplace, that's a pretty good thing. So, congratulations to you on a great launch, and I appreciate you giving us a little bit of time
Sure.
today to talk about the book. And I just will thank, of course, Advanced Power Alliance and our group is very pleased to host this, and also working with Energy Drives America podcast. So this will get turned into a podcast for listeners on the Energy Drives America podcast. So thank you to them for that support as well. And we're going to jump right in. I'll just ask participants if you have questions about the book or about this issue. And this is an incredibly complex. I knew it was a complex issue until I read the book, and then I got even more, frankly, got even more concerned about our ability as a nation to respond to the challenge. But if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A, and we're going to have time for that. But I'll give just a short introduction, then Ernie, I'm going to turn to you to talk about the book. So
Sounds great.
Ernest Scheyder, I'm going to take it straight from his bio because that seems to be the most accurate source. As senior correspondent for Reuters, and has covered, and looking back at your career, you've covered some things that have been of great interest to a lot of us in the energy space generally. But you were in the Bakken as the shale revolution occurred, and the huge transformation that shale has meant for America and energy security and our ability to provide energy to the world. And that had to have been an exciting thing to cover. But you've covered traditional oil and gas. Now you're covering the energy transition, the minerals and technologies that support it. You've worked connecting the energy industry, the political world, and concerns about the environment, and have worked at AP and in Bangor, Maine. And I noticed that you received. I grew up part of my life right across the river in Somersworth, New Hampshire, from Berwick.
Oh, no way.
And so I saw that you'd received an award from your alma mater as a hero of Maine. I forget the name of the award, but congratulations for being recognized at home as well. So the book that we're going to talk about, I was telling Ernie, I have lost the cover, but the book is The War Below, as you all know, and it has been in my bag for the last several weeks and has been a terrific read, but looks at this incredible challenge that we face as a country and a world as we find and produce and utilize the minerals and metals that we need to transition technologically and to make an energy transition, while at the same time respecting the environment, respecting our cultural sites. And at the same time, in the piece, Ernie, where I'm going to be circling back, is at the same time being incredibly cognizant of the fact that this transition is unstoppable, and we are very much in a war, appropriately named a war below, as we compete with China, our number one economic adversary, and potentially adversary in other ways, as we compete to secure those minerals and to keep the United States in the lead technologically. So I just want to thank you again for being with us. We'll open up. I'd love to hear about the book. I've got some questions. And again, I would ask everyone listening to go ahead and throw questions in the chat so we can talk with you more and have questions answered. So thanks again for being with us.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Jeff. Just by way of sort of broad background, so as you say, the book really looks at the complexities of the critical mineral transition. It builds off of my time here at Reuters, and I did previously, as Jeff mentioned, cover the oil and gas space. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I transitioned to look at the critical mineral space because I grew very curious about where the production of lithium and copper and cobalt and other critical minerals is going to come from if the world intended to accelerate this green energy transition. And even beyond the green energy transition requirements for things like solar panels and wind turbines, and yes, electric vehicles, there's also the electrification of so much of our everyday lives, things like cell phones, laptops, et cetera, et cetera. And so it really brought this idea of where we're going to get these building blocks from as increasingly so much of our world is going electric. And so that was the basis of the book, and really it drew out of my work at Reuters for the past 4 or 5 years. I was chronicling various projects, some inside the United States, some elsewhere, that had received strong opposition from various forces, whether that's for indigenous rights reasons or ecological reasons or biodiversity reasons. And the more I reported on these areas, the more I saw a cohesive narrative thread emerge. And I wanted to really bring to the reader here with The War Below this central idea of choice. That's the main theme for me here. What are the choices we're willing to make if we want an energy transition? If we feel that climate change is a serious issue and needs to be addressed with electrified, climate change abating devices, then we need to be talking about where we're going to get the building blocks for those devices. If we think that much of our everyday lives should be increasingly electrified with a lot of these devices powered by lithium ion batteries, then we need to be having a discussion about where we're going to get all of those critical minerals that goes into there. And I think if the coronavirus pandemic taught us anything, it taught us many things, but certainly one thing was that for too long, we in the United States especially have just expected things to be there when we need them. And I think the pandemic really brought to the fore for a lot of people the idea of supply chains, which is sort of it can be a bit of an esoteric topic, but it was 4 years ago this month that the world learned that the United States did not really make any masks, that sort of most basic medical piece of medical equipment. And that really underscored how important it is to maybe have shorter supply chains or maybe have things closer to home. If you extrapolate that into the electrification space, you start to see that right now the United States produces only trace amounts of lithium, very little cobalt, very little nickel right now. There's only one nickel mine in the United States. Most of the rare earths, which are used to make magnets that turn power into motion, most of that global industry is controlled by China. And so those are just four of the key critical mineral areas that I explore in the book. And I look at projects primarily in the United States because I wanted the reader to think through what it would look like for the US to have to actually grapple with where, how, and why the country wants to produce the building blocks for these green energy transition devices. I do look at some international projects and I do visit some as part of the reporting for the book, but most of the reporting involved physically going to proposed sites across the United States, especially in the US West, to bring to the reader this idea of choice. And for me, The War Below is a human story, because at the end of the day, these are all about people that are on all sides of these issues. And it really wasn't my job to say whether any of them were right or wrong. I really felt it was my job here as the author of the book to present all sides and to really help the reader, for her or himself, decide what are the choices she or he is willing to make. And so you get to learn the strong beliefs that many have, whether they're for or against projects, whether that's for economic reasons or indigenous rights or religious rights reasons, or the protection of rare species found nowhere else on the planet. These are complex, deep-seated issues that I think we need to be grappling with as we think about where we want our world to go. The global economy really was underpinned 100 and 150 years ago by crude oil. We got, obviously, a huge global economic expansion because of that. But what did we also get? We got global conflict over crude oil. We got climate change. We got a cartel that controls so much of the world's petroleum production. And what I'm presenting here in the book, if you read between the lines, is the warning almost that if we're not going to have those collective discussions about where we want to get critical minerals, that the world perhaps stands to make some of the same mistakes that were made 100, 150 years ago. So as we transition slowly from a petroleum-based global economy to one based on materials, we have to be having these discussions and grappling with the choice. And so that's really what I'm bringing here to the reader. And I feel very passionate about this topic and think it's something that should be digested not only for everyday citizens, but in companies and corporations across the country.
So Ernie, what was the moment, and like we talked about earlier, you've covered a lot of different aspects of the energy industry. What was the moment where the light turned on and you said, this is becoming an issue that is essential to attack now? Is there a project, or was there an international development that triggered that in you?
Well, I mean, I think one of the light bulb went off in my head, if you will, when I contrasted my time covering critical minerals with the oil and gas industry. I mean, I think for better or worse, the oil and gas industry gets attacked a lot by people that complain of its main contributions to climate change, or maybe some of its production practices. And it can be easy for someone to just sort of completely say that the oil and gas industry is a non-starter from the beginning and that we don't support it. And then some people take that approach. But what was really interesting for me here, and the more I reported out for this book, is that nearly everyone believes that we do need more of these critical minerals. Everybody, I would say 98% of the people I talked to for the book believe that we actually do need more of these. They say we do think climate change is serious. They say we recognize that things are going like increasingly electric, and so we are going to need increased supplies, but just not here, just not in this space because of these
Mhm.
reasons. And so when you add all of that up over a successive series of places, well, that adds up to a decrease in not only national production, but perhaps global production. And you did start to see some reason, and I started to see some regions of the world that were very willing to use their own production as economic weapons, as saying, okay, well, you don't want to produce it there, but we will gladly sell it to you. But they were
Mhm.
using that, as economic weapons. And so that was something that I was increasingly unpacking, not only in my day job, but thinking through like the potentials for a longer form narrative that really came to the fore here with the book. So I started to see those pieces emerge, and thought this would be a great book, and that's The War Below.
Yeah. We've been hostage in to some extent to hostile regimes or unstable regimes.
Yeah.
And we have seen, and I'm struck by, you write extensively about the Congo, the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the cobalt mining and child labor that takes place there, which of course and I was thinking as I read the book about, some of the oil and gas development in Western Africa,
Mm.
in some of the incredible environmental damage that has been done there, and certainly some labor issues as well. And it seems like we're making a choice between, and I would argue that American oil and gas is more heavily regulated, still problematic to some extent, but more heavily regulated. And I think from a national security perspective, vastly preferable to be buying fuels from the United States than from Russia or from these regimes in the Middle East that can be dangerous periodically. It seems like we're in a very similar place today where, as you said, 98% of folks are saying we need to have these critical minerals. We run the risk, if the United States cannot figure out how to develop them most in a regulated way, in the cleanest way, in the way that recognizes labor requirements and environmental requirements, that we run the risk of ending up with new cartels that are centered around lithium or cobalt or some other mineral, or ending up hostage to hostile regimes like China. To what extent has that national security narrative, as you've covered the political side, what response do you see from Washington, particularly in terms of our national security? Or do we contemplate a strategic reserve of these minerals? Or what is our national security response? Because it certainly seems like these aren't things we can live without at this point.
Right. All right. So there definitely are stockpiles that the Pentagon does strategically put aside each year for certain critical minerals, and that's a public list. The Pentagon puts it out the beginning of every fiscal year and says these are what we're targeting for acquisitions for certain materials and critical minerals. So that is out there, and that does change every year. Sometimes they are sold though, and that's for various reasons. Not all of these materials can be stored indefinitely, and sometimes the technology that they were used for might grow obsolete. So there's a lot of complexities that certainly go into that. I want to sort of caveat this answer by saying that. But some in Congress wish that the Pentagon would stockpile more or be more strategic in its stockpiling. I mean, we could sit here all day arguing about it. I mean, I guess I would say broadly, Jeff, there is a realization that more could be done for national security with regard to critical minerals. And so you do see the Pentagon, especially, trying to financially support certain critical minerals projects with grants. And I chronicle some of them, including the Mountain Pass mine in California in the book. This is a rare earths mine, and rare earths are crucial for the use of making magnets that go into things like fighter jets or laser guided missiles. Or other pieces of weaponry, as well as just everyday consumer goods like your cell phone. The thing that makes your cell phone vibrate is a rare earth magnet. And China controls about 80–90% of the global rare earths industry right now. So you could see that if China were to cut off exports of rare earths to the United States, it would have huge implications, not only on the consumer electronics space, but also on the national defense sphere. And so there are certain, as I was saying, financial grants that are being doled out to parts of the critical mineral supply chain. The tension that I was interested in exploring in, and I do in the book, though, is where one arm of the US federal government doesn't always necessarily operate in tandem with another. That is to say that the Pentagon might financially support a project, but the part of the government that would need to issue permits or take other steps to increase approval for the project might be in a different sort of operating in a different sphere, so to speak. So I chronicle in the book multiple instances where a project gets Pentagon funding, but doesn't necessarily have its permit yet, or gets funding from another arm of the government, but doesn't necessarily get its permits approved. And those things seem to be at odds to each other and indicate that perhaps the federal government isn't speaking with one voice on this issue. With lithium, it is less of a national security concern, but it's more of an economic concern. But you can imagine in the rare earth scenario that I just presented, where this could be something that could grow to be a national security issue. The government in China has cut off exports of rare earths before. They cut them off to Japan in 2010 after a diplomatic spat. Now, that was short-lived, but it sent a huge signal to Japan, and it sent shockwaves through Washington out of concern that the same could happen. More recently, we've seen China take steps to block the exports of germanium and gallium, minor metals to be sure, but still they have use in hardening for steel and other alloys. And you can imagine where do you want to harden steel the most? Things for like army tanks and things for like fighter jets, et cetera, in addition to bridges. And so these are sort of the implications that are being drawn out right now. And I really hope folks think through. I mean, this is one of the more stickier aspects of choice that I was talking about, but I really hope we think through what are the choices we're willing to make. And are we willing, if we don't produce more of these here domestically, then to have other countries use them and produce them perhaps at ESG standards that we might not consider acceptable?
Yeah. You talk about it, and a lot of this is very similar for those of us who are on the call, or those of our members who are on the call who are in renewable energy development.
Yeah.
We run into routinely, opposition at the local level that I would call NIMBY, that there is a need for electric power generation needs to be cited. And but oftentimes we run into opposition. And I saw USA Today this week said that about 15% of the United States has restrictions in place on the placement of wind or solar projects at this point. The mining, is in a similar way. You go to where the resource is, and you talk extensively about environmental issues. In one case, a flower that is unique. It's in one place in the United States, perhaps in the world, and could be jeopardized. One of our members, Heston, who says he's been with you 7,000 feet underground at a copper mine, Resolution Copper, and wanted me to congratulate you on a great book, but had asked about balancing these issues of how do we balance. We have climate change, which represents an existential threat certainly to a variety of different species, and but if we're paralyzed in our response to climate by a single species, how do we, and I know that's the question of the book, is how do we balance that? But maybe if you could share, and I know that you follow projects through the book all the way to the end. In some cases, you have, like every project, happy people and unhappy people at the end. But maybe share, if you could, the story of that project or another that we're balancing that goal of addressing climate, but also preserving these environmental resources.
Sure. The story there, Jeff, is around the Rhyolite Ridge lithium project. Is in Nevada, about 200 miles north of Las Vegas, and this is a massive deposit of lithium as well as boron. And the site also contains this rare flour found nowhere else on the planet. It's known as Team's buckwheat, and the company that would like to develop it has come into some tension with the conservation group, the Center for Biological Diversity, that is advocating for this flour. And the CBD, as the group is known, has said that it does not believe this is the place for lithium mining. Now, the company, it should be noted, says that it can do both. It can mine the lithium and preserve the flour. But the context there, and just the tension for me, was a great way to explore this idea of, should it just be one versus the other? Should both be allowed if both can happen simultaneously? What matters more, biodiversity or efforts to fight climate change? If the flower and the whole site was left alone, would the flower go extinct anyhow because of climate change? These are sort of the questions that I'm bringing to the audience with the story of this flower and this lithium deposit. And for me, it was just a great way to encapsulate this idea of choice. And I actually focus on this particular project the most in the book. It forms the spine, if you will, of the narrative, because the individuals that want to build this mine and the individuals that oppose this mine, they do it for various reasons. They're very human reasons all around, and they have unique stories of their own to tell. Any unique reasons why they want this mine to be built or don't want it to be built. And it really brings to the fore here, like, okay, are we going to let this flower go extinct if we let the mine go? Does that actually have to happen if the mine is built? What actually matters more? And if we just let a flower go extinct, then is that a slippery slope to then saying any number of other creatures, including animals, could go extinct? These are things that I hope people think through more. I mean, increasingly, you're seeing a lot of talk around biodiversity and how it's extremely important. The United Nations had an actual conference focused on biodiversity. It doesn't get as much attention as, say, COP, but it does have a lot of international players that come to it and talk through these issues right here. And this is for a mine that would produce lithium, right? Not crude oil, not natural gas. And so it would have a huge positive impact on the global environment. But therein lies the tension, and that you'd explore from the beginning. And so I'll let the readers explore what happens at the end of the book. But these are the tensions that I explore, because it requires, as we think through, as Heston said here in his question, what is this just sort of a binary? Does one happen or the other, or are there ways that both can coexist? And what do average Americans and citizens of the world think about these complex issues? Because these affect all of us.
And none of us are willing to live without these technologies.
Well,
We have
yes,
a point
that
where
is part of it, and I should say that there are some that advocate that we should go without it, and that was the I mentioned 98% earlier. Sort of the 2%, as I spent part of the book with somebody that actually does advocate for deindustrialization, a complete rollback of our global economy, the use of far less electricity, getting rid of the personal automobile, return to an agrarian way of life, and these are people that have marshaled strong opposition to a major lithium project that I chronicle in the book. And so it was important for me to get their perspectives as well, because they've been getting a lot of attention from Bill McKibben and sort of others in the environmental community. And so I got to spend time with these people and see the effects through their eyes as to what they think this proposed critical mineral projects could mean if indeed developed, and got to share their perspectives. And I did ask their thoughts on their own personal use of technology, which is in the narrative, and I'll let folks explore that, as well as their use of things like agriculture and medicines and whatnot. I mean, we're all thinking these questions, right? I mean, does this person use a computer? Does he use a cell phone? Have his own personal automobile? These are all things sort of we explore in the book, and it was important for me to sort of humanize all sides here in order to bring this story to the reader. I mean, the reader can make up for her or himself their perspectives on this and other individuals in the book, but it was just important for me to bring those to the audience.
So what role do you see for recycling? I know you touched on it a bit. The recycling is perhaps not as easy as
Yeah.
and we are experiencing that in wind and solar as we build out the recycling capacity for these projects. And the same is true of obviously on batteries, and we know it can be done, but there has to build that infrastructure. To what extent can recycling and repurposing these materials from prior uses address some of this problem?
Yeah, it was really important for me to include a meaty chapter in the book on recycling for many reasons. But one of the main reasons was the more I was reporting out this book, I got a lot of people saying, "Oh, can't we just recycle our way there? Don't we? Why do we need a new mine?" And when you look at the sheer demand of a lot of these devices, you realize that we're going to need virgin or mined material for years to come. That is not to say that we won't actually reach some point where recycling is the dominant supplier or perhaps the only supplier. And that's the idea known as a circular economy. That is like the old EV battery could be sent to a recycling center, broken down into its component parts and metals that are then reused to build a new battery. Yeah, I know I got a drawer full of old cell phones. I'm sure you do, Jeff. Many on the call, I'm sure do. Could you take those and reuse them and take the metals out into new to be made into new batteries? But there's a lot of complexity into that whole supply chain. There's certainly the technical aspect of physically breaking those batteries apart. And I go into in detail the proposed science that some companies are using. I also go into the transportation challenges because just imagine transporting a rail car full of old cell phone lithium ion batteries. That's a tinderbox waiting to happen. And so there's huge technical challenges around transportation. In fact, transportation is the biggest cost for recycling right now for safety reasons. And so what I explore in this chapter is the history of J.B. Straubel's Redwood, as well as Ajak Kachar's Life Cycle. And these are two North American recycling companies that have taken sort of different strategic approaches to how they're looking at the recycling supply chain. And I wanted to tell their stories to the reader to help them understand that there are different approaches to recycling. There are certainly different physical processes that can be used to recycle old batteries. And the challenges right now are different for each approach. And there are other companies out there that have their own approach. But there's a lot of structural challenges. And why there's structural challenges to mining is also challenges to recycling. And so it's not sort of a panacea. To all of the woes that face these supply chains. But I really wanted to bring that the complexity to the reader here in this chapter to underscore that recycling's got a lot of kinks to work out. I mean, a lot of wrinkles to be ironed out. And it's not going to solve all the problems right now. The question as to when we can get to that fully circular economy where all these old batteries are just repurposed and we don't need to dig any more mines. I mean, I think it's anyone's guess. Some people say 2050, some people say 2060, 2070. I think anybody that tries to put a finger on an exact date is just guessing. But what I do know, and we talk about this a little bit in the book, is that mining companies recognize that at some point, they're probably not going to put a shovel in the ground anymore. And that at some point, the recycling of these metals will be the biggest business. So you're already starting to see some companies sort of inch into that area. We see Albemarle, world's largest lithium company. It's got plans to build a massive lithium refinery here in the United States. And it's said that that refinery will include an option to expand in the future into recycling. So it's already sort of putting dipping its toes into that water, so to speak.
In the discussion you described and it was the first time I had ever contemplated it, but imagining a tractor trailer filled with old cell phones and lithium batteries that are partially charged. It really is a recipe potentially for fire, and as you said, that transportation, the safety issues add a tremendous amount of cost. To give some perspective, I found a press release from the White House in 2022, when as they were announcing initiatives on this, it said that they expected that the demand for rare earth minerals would grow by 400 to 600%, but that for certain elements such as lithium and graphite, the demand going forward could increase 4,000 to 6,000%. So really a tremendous amount of growth. We saw recently and published on our website an announcement from ExxonMobil as they are ramping their lithium production in Arkansas, which struck. It's in our region, and we were excited to see it and happy to see it. But it was interesting, of course, to see Exxon moving into this space. What other strange, strange transitions or diversifications are you seeing in some of these traditional oil and gas companies as this moves forward?
I think, from Exxon's perspective, they would see it as a natural outcrop because what they're planning to do is take brine that is in this underground formation in parts of Arkansas known as the Smackover, and this brine is basically salty water, and it teems with a lot of lithium in this particular deposit, and if you can extract the lithium using what's known as direct lithium extraction, then you can produce lithium without an open pit mine or without large evaporation ponds, which are the two existing common ways to produce lithium. Now, direct lithium extraction technology has never worked independently at commercial scale, so Exxon and many others are rapidly looking into this area and hoping that something can stick. And I do talk a little bit about in the book some companies that are working with Exxon or trying to sell Exxon services about these to accomplish these areas. But even beyond Arkansas, I mean, the appeal for the oil industry involves the filtering of lithium from produced water. So when you think about when you extract oil from an underground well or reservoir, oil obviously comes out, but a lot of water comes out too. And that water has been a cost center for oil companies for many, many, many years. You have to pay somebody to dispose of it in a disposal well. The potential there for profit comes in if you could filter lithium out of that. There'd be trace amounts of lithium, but if you have a device like a direct lithium extraction unit that could filter lithium out of that produced water, then you would imagine that cost center becomes a profit center. And so there's a lot of things still to figure out, but that is the interest so far from the oil industry is to be able to do this. You see companies like Schlumberger that are moving into this area, as well as other traditional oil and gas producers and service providers. So if they can figure this out, I think it'll be sort of an interesting way to bring more lithium onto the global market just as demand continues to spike. But there's a lot of technical challenges there that need to be figured out. But Jeff, you're right. I mean, we would have not been having this conversation 5, 10 years ago, right? Exxon getting into lithium, it would not
Mhm.
have been something on many people's radars. But the Exxon has said publicly that they feel that this is part of their core competency. I mean, they know how to drill a well, they know how to look at subsurface geology, and they feel like those give them a leg up over some competitors. So I'm interested to track it in my day job, and we'll see where it goes in the coming years. But right now, that's the promise. And the book looks at the history of direct lithium extraction, including the scientists that helped invent it at Dow Chemical, and explore the story of how it has slowly been coming closer and closer and closer to commercialization. So you get to see that in the book and really feel the human drama there.
Yeah, we are careful. We don't talk about the energy transition. We talk about the energy expansion, and
Mm.
what I think we're most being in states that have had a traditional energy industry. We're excited to see a convergence as these companies come together with us as part of the energy expansion. Walker had a question about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and that a lot of our traditional allies like Australia, Chile, Argentina have large reserves of these minerals. Has the was did leaving the Trans-Pacific Partnership and losing access to some of those areas affect our ability to access the minerals that we need? And do you think there's potential to rehabilitate those relationships outside of the TPP?
Well, I would actually say the IRA has had a bigger impact here, the Inflation Reduction Act, because the Inflation Reduction Act links consumer tax credits, excuse me, to where critical minerals are produced, whether they're produced domestically or with U.S. countries with U.S. free trade deals. And Chile and Australia do have U.S. free trade deals, and so their metals, their copper, their lithium, et cetera, are Inflation Reduction Act compliant. And so that's been a big benefit, as you would imagine. And I would actually say perhaps tweak it a little bit. It's been an expansion of the relationship there. And so the US has been very open about wanting to continue and enhance its partnerships with Chile and Australia. Argentina does not have a U.S. free trade deal agreement, but there have been many in the lithium industry that feel that lithium extracted out of the ground there, but processed further in the United States or elsewhere could be IRA compliant. So a company known as Arcadium, which recently merged, it used to be called Livent, has been very vocal about this. And so I would say I can't comment too much around the critical minerals aspects of the TPP, but what I can say is the IRA has done a lot to help expand relationships between the U.S. and countries with U.S. free trade deals. But I talk about this in The War Below in the book. The inherent tension, though, if you can't get mines approved in the United States, like how do you get the EV tax credit, or if there's opposition elsewhere in the world, and does that just further enhance the mining supply chains in other parts of the world, even if they have U.S. free trade deals? So is the IRA designed to help Australian mines and Chilean mines? I think Senator Joe Manchin, who wrote the piece of legislation, would say probably no. And just think about the long um, just the long routes. I mean, Chile is one of the world's largest lithium producing regions right now. And in the northern Atacama Desert, it uses evaporation ponds to produce the metal. So think about this long supply chain. You've got lithium that comes out of the ground there that is then trucked to the Pacific coast and shipped across the Pacific to more processing in Asia, perhaps China, where it's then put into a cathode, which is part of a battery, which is then put into a battery pack, and then might be further manufactured and then maybe sent back across the ocean to an electric vehicle plant in, say, Nevada. And then that electric vehicle is then shipped to, say, a customer in Florida. But that's an extremely long supply chain right there. And that's sort of a quick and dirty overview. But just think about that metal going across the Pacific Ocean twice, which is very, very common. And so that obviously increases emissions and has other deleterious effects. And so would that be abrogated or lessened if that lithium was extracted out of the ground in the United States? Probably, or at least North America. So these are other things I think that we have to be thinking through here right now.
There was a project in and forgive me, I don't know if this is mentioned in the book, but I saw that there was a project that the Infrastructure Act had helped to fund to recover critical minerals, rare earth minerals from existing coal ash piles. And again, kind of going back to that recycling, but I was intrigued by mine waste and coal ash piles that without the need for new mining, and certainly this won't meet the entirety of our demand. But I was fascinated that this coal ash that has been such in a very similar way to what you described with oil and gas, these waste piles may indeed provide a revenue stream that no one had contemplated 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's an area that is, I would say, getting more and more attention from the mining industry and folks even beyond it. And sort of the quick and dirty here is that there's a lot of waste when you produce any sort of mined material. So the grade, which is basically the percentage of rock that might contain a metal, let's say copper, on average, it could be a 1% or less. And so that typically means if you extract 100 pounds, maybe you've got 99 pounds of waste. And you'd imagine that's not just random dirt in there. There could be other metals besides copper that perhaps could have some value. And so what a lot of mining companies are finding is that they're sitting on years and years and years worth of tailings and other waste that are just sitting there. And so one company, especially that I chronicle in the book, Freeport-McMoRan, a massive copper company, it owns and operates the largest mine of any metal in North America, the Morenci mine in Arizona. This is a giant copper producing mine that's been around for more than a century, but it also has huge, huge piles of tailings waste that are just sitting there. And so the company is experimenting with ways to basically leach or apply a leaching solution to the top of those tailings ponds that would leach out more copper and other minerals. And this would be an extremely cheap way to do it. Because think about it, you're not hiring, you don't need to have more staff or a lot of staff to run trucks or anything. You need fewer trucks. The piles are just sitting there, so you just need to spray on top of it and collect the solution at the bottom. And so this could be a very, very, very productive way to produce copper. And that's just copper as an example. Rio Tinto is experimenting with ways to add its smelter in Utah to be able to maybe take some waste streams that would have been burned off in a smelter, but basically produce sort of some minor metals, excuse me, there as well. So the idea of sort of thinking full circle and not just sort of taking one metal has been increasingly getting the attention of the mining industry.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's fascinating the innovations that are following demand. And I had a question, and this is the last question that we have, so I'll just throw it out one more time and remind folks, if you have a question, get it in now, because we're gonna run out of time here briefly. And I had a question about the likely scenarios and it's a interesting analogy. There was a time when we restricted the use of natural gas because it was too valuable to burn for electric power generation. I know we have some companies that we work with in the chemical industry who still feel that way, and would prefer to have it as a feedstock. But do you envision, with demand exceeding supply and with the security implications, some sort of restriction on the use of materials for those reasons?
Well, we have not seen those. We haven't seen any hint of that yet from Washington. What we do know is that the demand is going to spike, and so without more supply, it's going to lead to some really interesting situations. We talked earlier about the transition or from a coal-powered, excuse me, from an oil-powered economy to a materials-based economy, and that's going to mean a lot of copper, for instance. And if the world doesn't produce more copper, it's going to bring up some really interesting questions about, okay, well, where can we get it? Now, wars were fought in the 20th century over oil. Some analysts have warned that without more copper supply, we could see armed conflicts over copper, which is sort of mind-boggling when you think about it.
Mhm.
And it's sort of, we think of copper as sort of ubiquitous out there right now, and it can be recycled, of course. But seeing armed conflicts over copper would sort of just be a mind-boggling scenario. And the stark increasing demand for copper is something that companies like Freeport-McMoRan and others have repeatedly flagged and said, if we want this transition, we have to be having discussions about where we're going to get more copper. And so this is definitely front of mind for industry and policymakers alike, I would say.
That is fascinating. The word, the title again, The War Below. We'll include a link in the video. We'll distribute this out to our members, and as I said, this will be on the Energy Drives America podcast, and we'll include a link to Amazon if folks want to pick up a copy of the book. The title intrigued me, The War Below, because it seems like it's so many different levels of conflict between potentially strategic and economic adversaries, but then that internal war that we have, balancing the environmental concern, the social justice concern, the demand for these. Not only are they critical minerals, but they're critical to our daily lives, so far beyond the term. But there is a lot of different levels of conflict, no different from the conflict, as you pointed out, the conflict that we faced over the last 150 years in an economy that was dependent on oil, or even prior to that, in an economy that was dependent upon coal. So it's an interesting time. I think to close out, I'd love to just ask you, you have been on the road, you've been all over media, talking about the book and meeting with some of the best minds in energy. I'm curious, what is, to close us out here, what's the most interesting question you've been asked? And would you tell us the question and the answer to kind of wrap up today?
You're turning the tables on me as a journalist. Usually sort of an interesting place for me to be. I get a lot of folks that ask me who's the most interesting person that I met when I was reporting out this book, and I met a lot of really interesting people that thankfully gave up their time to really help flesh out this human story. But I met the mayor of Superior, Arizona. Her name is Mila Bisic, and she's a fascinating person and a great advocate for her town and her community. And you would sort of think stereotypically that the fight over this copper mine, which is the Resolution Copper Project there in Arizona, would sort of just have one side versus the other. But she comes at this from a third or sort of fourth even perspective, where she advocates for the mine to open. She wants the jobs. But she doesn't necessarily acquiesce to everything that the mining industry wants. I mean, far opposite, actually. She has been very vocal about more subsidies from the mining industry and more financial support for education, and really sort of insisting that the mining industry makes a better use of its connections to host communities, perhaps more so than it has been in the past. And so that brought a different perspective for me as the writer here, as the author, and as someone who was reporting this out. And it really helped to sort of broaden for me this idea that sometimes it's not just black or white. There are many, many sides to this issue and many different perspectives. And so that further underscores the complexities here. And that's really a core reason why I wanted to write The War Below. I really feel like this is a book for everyone, and I wrote it for everyone, not just for geologists or investors. But I wrote it for everyone because it's a topic that affects us all. And I really think that this is the kind of book that different executives will love to speak with their employees about and sort of talk through about, maybe at corporate book clubs or something, to really unpack the complexities here for folks to understand that there's a lot of choices to be made as this energy transition accelerates, as this energy expansion, as you said, Jeff, and that we have to be thinking through these things. We can't just put our heads in the sand anymore.
And you said it well, it's engaging that community. We've seen that in our work, that people, when they're opposed to what we're doing, a lot of times it's a matter of communicating what we're trying to do for the benefit of everyone. And that's true on the mining and production of these minerals. So I lost the cover, as I said, but the book is called The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And by Ernest Scheyder. Ernie, thank you. And thanks for giving us so much of your time. And I'm glad that we could make this happen. And with your permission, we'll connect. If folks have questions to follow up, we'll connect them with you via
That'd be
email.
great. I'm happy to talk to anyone about the book, any of your members. And, if they want to do maybe smaller talks at their businesses or wherever, I'm happy to do that as well. So looking forward to the conversation, and thank you for your interest.
Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.